Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Behind the CV for today. I don't know if it's actually on me, Michelle. I don't see myself highlighted. Is it working okay?
Oh, thanks for reminding me. I will do so now.
Oh, that's better. That makes sense. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Behind the CV, where we hear life stories from faculty that touch on the sort of things that you wouldn't learn from looking at their website or their CV. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Jennifer Morton, who is the Presidential Penn Compact Associate Professor of Philosophy, and also has a secondary appointment at the Graduate School of Education. Jennifer, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Tyler. Thank you for having me. I like the idea of the series a lot, the kind of behind the CV. So I guess, should I just take it away? I'm going to tell you a little bit.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I'm a philosopher and I work in moral and political philosophy, and particularly I look at philosophy of action, philosophy of education, moral psychology, and I'm interested in social class and the ways in which it impacts our agency. I guess maybe the best way to get started is to talk about my experience in graduate school and afterwards, because I think that was really a formative period for me. So I was an undergrad at Princeton, and when well, before I should say, I grew up in Lima, Peru, and I came to the United States to go to Princeton, which was, a big shock. I'm like the first person in my family to go to college, and the first college campus I ever set foot on was Princeton's campus. That was a somewhat of a bizarre experience, but I had a good time there, and I majored in philosophy. And when it came time to figure out what I was going to do next, as an immigrant and a first generation college student, I really didn't have very good ideas about what else I could do besides go to grad school. I'm like, I like philosophy, I like school, I'll just keep doing that. So I went to Stanford for my PhD, and Stanford was, I was very fortunate, a really nice department. People were collegial. Obviously, it's beautiful and sunny in California. And I had a really good time in grad school. And I had approached graduate school and going to graduate school not with an eye to what would happen later, but really thinking someone's going to pay me to do more philosophy in beautiful California. I'm like, I'm in. I just didn't have these kind of ambitions about what would happen later. And I think that really helped me enjoy graduate school and get a lot out of it. But by the time that I was about to be done with my PhD, everybody who was applying for jobs, or a lot of the people in my cohort, and a lot of the kind of anxiety about what would happen later started to creep in. So despite the fact that I had arrived at graduate school not really thinking about what would happen later, by the end, I feel like I had bought into a lot of these ideas about what was a good job and what was a prestigious job, and like what I should be looking for in terms of my career, and where I should be publishing and all this stuff. And at the time, I think actually Stanford was unusual and that we were somewhat protected from those sorts of pressures until the end. But then at the end, it really was striking when you went out on the job market, and other people at other programs had been sort of approaching graduate school with an eye to what would happen later from much earlier than I had, or some of my cohort had. And so my first year on the job market was brutal. I didn't get, I got some interviews. I didn't get a tenure track position. I did end up getting a visiting position at Swarthmore College, just down the road from us. And it was a great position, but in some ways it made me realize how unhappy I had been with like some of the choices I had made and how I had approached this whole thing. I was really tired of my dissertation project. This is not to say anything negative about the Swarthmore students, but teaching wasn't very fulfilling because in a way the students were so well prepared that I found myself thinking like, I'm just an interlocutor for these students who are already like incredibly, smart, professionalized, already had that kind of intellectual environment. And so I didn't feel very confident as a teacher. Like it was very rewarding. I wasn't really happy with my research project. And I think a lot of what affected me was really the status issues, even though to some extent I had been trying to push those aside and I didn't really buy into like, I need to get an R1 job or something like that. It had somehow creeped in. And so I felt really, I think, insecure about my standing in the profession. And so that was kind of a dark time. I had also at that point decided that I wasn't willing to move anywhere for my job. And I had a lot of good friends in New York. And so I got asked to apply to a postdoc at CUNY. And the person who asked me to apply said, oh, it might turn into a tenure track job. So you should apply. So I thought, well, I have a lot of good friends in New York. I don't want to go anywhere. So that year I just basically applied to a couple of jobs and that were within the New York area, and that postdoc, which I did get. You know, for the graduate students, you should know that when somebody, you know, says this might turn into a tenure track job, you should always get that in writing, because that might not mean what you think it means. So when I got there, they were like, oh, this might actually be more difficult than we thought, you know. And at Swarthmore, they had said that they were going to have a tenure track job eventually and not be a good candidate, but I had kind of left to go back to New York. And so I was lucky in that I had a grant, which for a humanities person is very rare. And the department was able to use the fact that I had a grant to argue for switching me into a tenure track job. But if I had just relied on the person who hired me's word and didn't have this grant, I would have been kind of stuck in this situation there. So I was very lucky. It wasn't the kind of job that my cohort in graduate school would have thought was the job to apply for, right, or to get. It was at a public university, they didn't have a lot of funding. The teaching load was high, and the research support wasn't as good as it is at some other places. But it actually was a perfect job for me. And I think that's something to keep in mind, that, you know, what the kind of status hierarchies that exist in academia would tell you is a good job might not be the best job for you. And it's really hard to acknowledge that, or to kind of understand that. So the reasons that this was a really good job for me is that I got to teach a student population that challenged me as a teacher. So I got really into pedagogy and thinking about how to teach my students, and found it incredibly rewarding to get better at teaching because of the students I had. Most of my students were working class students, first generation students, low income students. Most of my students were students of color. And they were working really hard to get a college degree. And they had a lot of stuff happening in their lives, and they were so determined, and are still so determined. And so I just found it really fulfilling to teach those students, and it kind of brought me back to loving my job in a way. And the other thing that I think was really important is that the tenure expectations were not super high. Most people got tenure. If you were publishing and you were a reasonably good teacher, and you did some service, you were going to get tenure. And so I didn't approach my research with the stress that you would have in an R1 institution, where the thought is like, you need to be publishing in the top journals, and you need to be publishing in a way that will be legible as excellent to people at certain schools or at certain positions, or will write you certain letters. I just, I think as long as I did like some good work and published a couple of papers in good journals, I had every confidence that I would get tenure. And that really freed me. And so, being Latina, being first gen, and philosophy, that's rare. There is a kind of freedom, I think, at being an institution that isn't trying to decide whether you're the best philosopher of your generation and that's the standard you're supposed to meet, where it's just like, well, like, are you a good colleague? Are you doing your job and teaching these students? And are you publishing, in like some good journals? And that was really the expectation. And I feel very lucky that I got that job, although at the time I would have, I think, from the perspective of the kind of group of people I was coming from and the, being at Stanford and at this kind of fancy place, it didn't seem like the best job. And I would often have friends be like, oh, you're like, you should be at a better job. Like you should be somewhere else. They would say stuff like that. And I knew they meant well, and they were, trying to sort of, indicate how much they valued my work, but I think they just didn't realize that for me it just worked really well. And I was able to navigate getting research support. CUNY's a bureaucratic institution, but you can find the support if you're looking out for opportunities, for grants, for leaves. Like there are lots of things you can apply for to reduce your teaching load, to have some money to go to conferences and stuff like that. So I had a great time there, and sort of got comfortable being a professor there. And the other wonderful thing that happened was that I got interested in education and philosophy of education. I had a very standard research project that was, in line with what my advisor at Stanford did. And I had never really thought or known about philosophy of education. But the reason I got interested in it was because my students, I was sort of struck by the challenges they faced and how the discourse around the challenges that students faced often focused on financial challenges, which they definitely had, academic challenges, which some of them had, but there were really smart, bright students there, as much as anywhere else. But I noticed that a lot of the challenges they had actually had to do with the kind of support roles that they played for their families and their connections to their community, and how difficult it was for them. A lot of them were commuters, so it was very difficult to manage trying to get a college degree, going to classes, studying, and doing all the stuff that they were doing at home, whether it was working to support their families or help financially, taking care of children, their own children, or their siblings' children, or like younger siblings, or taking care of grandparents, or helping, parents or grandparents that didn't speak English when they had to go to court or they had to go to the doctor. So they were doing all this stuff on top of going to college. I mean, often I was like, I would have never finished college under these conditions. I was just amazed by everything they did. But I got interested in reading about education, the philosophy of education, and some of the, not just in philosophy, but in social science, stuff about higher education. And I noticed that was sort of missing from the discourse. A lot of the discourse was about financial challenges and academic challenges. And so that spurred like a whole new research project that I would not have, I think, ever arrived at had I been, I've gone from Stanford to Penn straight away or something. It actually was critical for me that I was at that place at CUNY, teaching those students, and learning from them and learning about their lives. And so, yeah, it's sort of, sometimes these things don't go the way that you think they're going to go. And for me, that was research that was really meaningful. It was really interesting. I think by nature, not the kind of person that just sticks to their discipline. I like reading outside of philosophy. I read a lot in the social sciences. I read a lot in psychology, economics. And the stuff I was doing on higher education allowed me to do that, to read widely. And so, yeah, so then I got really interested in that. And I was fortunate to get a visiting fellowship at the Center for Human Values at Princeton that allowed me the time and the kind of energy to focus on writing this book, which really turned my career around. I mean, I was doing other stuff that was, I think, more traditional, mainstream analytic philosophy that was, I was publishing in good enough journals, but I think the stuff in education really kind of distinguished my work from other people's work. And the other thing I would say is that because I was at CUNY and the tenure expectations weren't so demanding, I felt pretty confident that I had enough mainstream publications to get tenure. So I was able to work on this book and write it to a non-academic audience because I was pretty confident at that point that my file would be fine for tenure, given the papers I had in more like standard mainstream analytic philosophy. And that again, like if I had been somewhere else, I wouldn't have been able to make that choice. So yeah, that worked out really well for me. But by the time that I was coming up for tenure, CUNY, I mean, this is something that's happening all over the country with public universities, but they were constantly facing budget shortfalls. And so the working conditions were getting worse and worse. That went all the way from like infrastructure in the university, like there's like leaks in the classrooms and like paint peeling and like the escalators don't work, all this stuff, to just having bigger and bigger classes. So when I got there, I taught this intro to philosophy writing course that had 25 students, which is already a little bit big for teaching writing, but not crazy. But by the end, they had raised the student cap to 40, which is impossible. Like you cannot teach 40 students writing all in one class, right? It's very difficult to really do that. And so I started to feel like the working conditions weren't great. And then I got approached by the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill about going there. And I did. And yeah, that was great. I really liked UNC, but then ultimately my family now wanted to be back in the Northeast. So here I am. But yeah, I guess the lessons I would draw in thinking about talking to students is that there is a kind of trajectory, especially if you go to a place like Penn or for me, Princeton, Stanford, places like that, that is the mark of achievement, right, that we have in our mind, which is like you go to this like Ivy League school or Ivy League plus school, and then you go get your PhD another place like that or similar, and then later you're gonna, like, the goal is to get a job at a place like that, or a really elite public university, right, that is basically like a private public university like Chapel Hill or University of Michigan or Berkeley. And it's really easy to feel like you're failing if you're not on that path. But I think being on that path can be really constraining as a researcher. And in particular, I think if you're interested in doing things, at least for me in philosophy, that have to do with class or race or topics that are a little bit more controversial or that are a little bit like outside of the mainstream, it's really hard to do that stuff within the kind of R1 super elite places. And that wasn't something that I really realized until I was in it. And I realized that I had a lot more freedom being somewhere that wasn't like that, and that was the tenure expectations weren't crushing. They weren't like super panic inducing or anxiety inducing. I think there's a lot of freedom that can come from that. And that often we don't tell students. So there's this sort of like immediate assumption that the best job that you should take the best job that you get, and the best job that you can get is one, like at a research university, where the expectation is that you will be the next big thing in your field. That can be really stressful. And just really, and for some people it can just be crushing, and it can lead, and I've seen this with people I know, it can lead to them doing work that is very in line with what the expectations are, or the topics or the themes are that are sort of seen as serious or important right now. But that can itself be a risky strategy. Like it might be that when you come up for tenure, people are like, yeah, it's fine. Like this person does fine work, but it's not, they're not like revolutionizing the field, like tenure denied. And then and I see people kind of feel like I played by the rules, I did the things that were expected of me. So yeah, sometimes having a little bit more freedom somewhere that is not in that kind of I don't even know what to call it, where the expectations are all like excellence, right? You're going to be the best, and that's what we expect of you. I think there can be a lot of freedom not being in spaces like that for a little bit. Yeah, so I think that's all I have to say, but I'm happy to chat more. And I don't know, Tyler, if you have questions.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this. So one question I had, I mean, at the beginning, we're talking about approaching grad school sort of with that idea of, hey, they're going to pay me to do what I enjoy doing. So, why not? As opposed to a mindset that maybe comes on later of, geez, how much do I need to be publishing to get this R1 faculty job after, and where am I going next, right? Do you think it's possible to sort of encourage that kind of mindset among students now? Or, I mean, if you do, like, how do you do that, right? How do you get people to see it that way if they're already coming in the other way?
It's really tough because so much of it is set by the institution and the culture of an institution. And it is hard for a student who's in a place that has that culture to sort of buck that trend. So I remember at some point when I was at Stanford, I was just like feeling really kind of distressed by the looming market, and having this feeling where it's like, what I want is not what I'm being expected to want, and yet I feel like bad about not getting the thing that everybody expects me to want, despite the fact that I'm not sure that's what I want. And talking to this professor who is like, oh, it's kind of like an ideology and every place has it, right? And you like, it's really hard to fight against it because it's everywhere. We operate under those assumptions. And that to me was helpful. But I think more important, what I tell students is to find spaces where you are having some distance from that. So what was helpful for me about living in New York is that I had a lot of friends from college who are not academics, right? And who I could hang out with. And this meant nothing. You got rejected from this journal, or like, you're going to this conference, and like all of this stuff means nothing to them. So that can be really helpful. I think having a space where that's not the primary part of your identity that people are seeing you through, that you're being kind of judged by, right? So I encourage graduate students usually like stay in touch and try to see your friends that are not in the program, right? Because if you're only hanging out with people in the program, you all kind of feed off each other's energy around this stuff, right? Like it's like, oh, one grad student got a publication, now they all talk about it and they all know, and then some of them feel bad that they haven't published and they're worried about that, and should I be publishing? But if you're hanging out with people that are not in your department or your cohort, that's not what you're going to talk about, right? And so unavoidably, you're going to end up thinking about other stuff and kind of having some distance from that aspect of the culture.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Not trying to tie your identity to just that one part of your life too.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So actually, on this kind of theme, as a first generation student, I mean, did you ever? I'm just curious about how, like, talking with your family went about why you're doing this and doing philosophy and doing grad school. I mean, is that ever hard, or was that?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually, I remember when I was applying to, no, I guess I was already in college telling my mom that I was going to major in philosophy. I think I thought philosophy or math. Those were like the two things. And she cried and she was like, "You're going to be on the streets." And, you know, she really like thought things were going to go really badly for me. And that was difficult, but I mean, it's tough. On the one hand, you want your parents to feel invested in, like, they're supporting you and stuff like that. But then there's also stuff they don't understand, right? I think my mom didn't understand what it meant for me to go to Princeton. I was like, it's fine. Even if I get a math degree from Princeton, I could have tons of jobs that would not like leave me homeless on the streets. But she didn't understand that, and so. Yeah, sometimes you kind of have to have the confidence to just say, like, it'll be, and of course now she's fine with it. She's like, "You're employed." But it took a little while for her to come around. And so for my book, I talked to first generation or low income students who have, quote unquote, made it, right? And one of the things that these students, or now they're professionals, talk about is navigating the dynamics with their families and people back home and how difficult they can be. And that is something that I think it's important to tell first generation students and low income students to prepare for, that can be like a cost of this upward mobility, right? That their relationship might feel estranged or like difficult or not like it used to feel. Yeah, and I mean, and that's unfortunate.
Anne, did you want to hop in?
First, I just wanted to say that, yes, I understand I think the maternal reaction. My father, when I went to university, only gave me two pieces of advice, or two dictates, one of which was don't drink the punch. And the other one was never take a philosophy class. You're not allowed to take a philosophy class.
Yeah, that's the punch.
Yeah, so, you know, those are clearly equivalent. But you talked a lot about these, you know, expectations creeping in and, you know, not hanging out with people who are in what I would call this sort of pressure cooker mindset, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, I feel like first generation or in some cases lower income students are lucky because they don't have those sort of expectations, at least at the beginning, right? Because they're entering into a new arena. And so they just get to do, if they're able to make that happen, able to do the things that they want to do without those expectations. Do you have a sense of when, you know, being on this elite track, sort of when that pathway, that expectation of that pathway, when those things crept in? You said they crept in, and you had to sort of actively work to undo your own sense of self-worth from those. I'm wondering if we can identify the source, the unwritten code, right? If we can then make it written and then have something concrete against which to push, because I think you're right there, you know, even when you say in your book, you talk about making it, right? There's so many definitions of making it, and yet there seems to be only one that people who are at this sort of IB plus sort of environment seem to be okay with. And it's interesting to me, even when you say that, you know, they weren't academics, like, you know, at least at Penn, the making it seems to be getting a high-powered consulting job that is at least 6 figures just starting out, right?
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, I think this is becoming worse. Like, it's generational. I think I've noticed it with my students here, and I've talked to them about it, right? And so there is this, I'm teaching first year students, and another class from our upper class students, but the first year students are already really worried about their internships and like how they're going to make the right choices about what classes to take in order to make sure that they're on the right path to get the job they need to get at the end of their time at Penn. And I mean, there were definitely people like that at Princeton, but that wasn't the dominant for me. That wasn't the dominant experience, especially not my first year of college or my second year of college. Then my junior year, people start to like think about that. But there were plenty of people I knew who just took the summer to go home or like have some job that pays the bills, and then you hang out with your friends, whatever. And that's not like what the students I'm talking to are thinking. And yeah, I think it's really sad. So I've been trying to tell them, what I've been trying to tell them is that sometimes discovering something new that will like excite you, like a new valuable path or a new valuable pursuit, requires that there's some like space in your life for it, right? So that if you already have it all planned out and you're like maniacally pursuing your goal of getting a certain kind of job or getting to law school or getting to med school, and there's no slack in your life, like it's unlikely that you're going to have this moment where maybe you discover that there's something else you're passionate about, right? Or you discover like some artistic thing that you want to pursue or something else. And so I think that is a danger, right, of being so focused. And to some extent, it is who you're around. And I think it is something that's getting worse. And I was actually talking to another faculty member about it this morning, because I think like it definitely wasn't true like, you know, a few generations ago. I don't think when I was in college it was that bad, but I now see it with students, and I saw it with my students at UNC too, where they look around and they're like, everybody has a plan and they're all, you know, trying to network or get the right internship or get the, you know, and it's so stressful. So the pressure cooker starting earlier definitely seems to be like a trend that at least I see. I mean, I don't have research on that, but I do see that with the students. And I think realizing that you can follow that trajectory and still feel pretty unsatisfied with where you are, you kind of don't want to go down that road very far and then realize that you had this plan and you thought if you accomplish your plan, you would be happy. And then you accomplish your plan and you're like, oh, this is actually not right what I wanted, or at least I don't feel satisfied in the way that I thought I did. Yeah.
There's actually an entire program that's grown up at the School of Social Policy and Practice here at Penn that's almost entirely populated by young, 5 to 10 year out professionals who are coming back for retraining, who have been on this treadmill, realized 5 to 10 years out of Penn that really this is not what they want to do. And they have, there's enough impetus just within one university to create like an entire,
yeah,
there's a captive audience basically. Anyway, so thank you for that. Yeah.
Carrie, do you want to?
Yeah. First of all, I loved hearing your story. I love a story with twists and turns. And I thought it was just great hearing about your personal journey. And I love what you said about just because something seems to be the right track or the right path by the vocal majority doesn't mean that it's right for you, or doesn't mean that the best is the best for you, and to really be thoughtful about what is best for you personally. I was wondering if along the way, and especially when you kind of pivoted a little or ended up at CUNY, and you mentioned, your friends from grad school making well-meaning but maybe misguided comments about you don't belong there, or you could do better. How, or did you have support from mentors along the way, or how did that look like when you decided to kind of go maybe a different route from what your own mentors maybe at Princeton or Stanford had done?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. That's so important. So when I first got into philosophy of education, I had no idea really what I was doing. I was like, I'm interested in education. I'm reading all the social science. There's some philosophy. So I called someone at Stanford who wasn't on my committee, but was a faculty member that I knew had published in philosophy of education a little bit. And I talked to her and I said, I'm interested in the stuff. And she said, apply for a grant from the Spencer Foundation. They have this new philosophy stuff initiative. Just apply for that. And so I did, and I got it. And the person who was sort of looking over the grant applications and running that program was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who became my mentor, basically. He just said, and he has a history of doing this. He's done it for a lot of people in the profession, and especially people working in this area. And he's well regarded. And so he just was very actively my mentor, and invited me to conferences, invited me to Madison, read my work, gave me feedback. I mean, it was just wonderful. And I now when someone's sort of interested in that stuff, I'll send them to him and I'll say, you should talk to Harry. It's great. And I mean, that is one of those kind of total luck, right? That you get hooked up with the right person. But I think there's also a kind of, at least in philosophy, and I'm sure in other fields, a kind of rumor mill that you can, not in a bad, there's the rumor mill about bad things that people do, but there's also the one about who are good mentors and who are the people that are willing to just take on and mentor someone who they have no institutional affiliation with. And so I was lucky that I had, he's my friend now and he's a mentor still, but that was really key because it was someone who was senior, very well known, and vouching for me, right, in a way that was really helpful, and also was willing to answer all my questions about what the next step was and what I was doing and all this stuff. And so yeah, that is so important. I should also say, for the students listening to this, when I got to grad school, I thought I was going to work with one philosophy professor that was doing work that I was interested in as an undergrad. And when I got there and I met him and got to see him in action, I was like, I don't think I want to work with this person. He's fine, but he just wasn't, he's not a teacher mentor, right? He's a very smart person who is willing to give people feedback on their work and advise students, but he doesn't have that sort of mentor / teacher thing, whatever it is, right? But I took a class with Michael Bretman, who is my advisor, and he put so much thought into his teaching and how he interacted with the students and giving feedback. And I just thought, I don't care what the topic is. I want this person to be my mentor because I knew that I had a lot to learn from him and that he was willing to be a good teacher. So I think it's so important to choose the right advisor. I mean, there are people, I'm not constituted this way. There are people who are like, I'm going to do my thing, right? I came to grad school. I know exactly what I'm going to do. I just need this person to read my dissertation when it's done and sign off or write me a letter, right? I needed someone, I think it's part of being first generation college student too, or who was going to hold my hand a little bit more and who really was going to play that kind of, it's almost like a parent, you know, who was going to be invested in me as a person and was going to be supportive and be available. And so that's how I picked who my dissertation advisor was, because I could see it have gone horribly wrong if I had just stuck to the thing I thought I was going to do. Because yeah, this other philosopher who's does incredible research, but he definitely is not trying to meet with his students every week or like advise them on like the nitty gritty of like a conference they're going to or a talk, like all of that stuff. He's just not going to do that. Whereas I picked an advisor that I knew would do that for me. And, I try to pay it forward with students now. This is like the important part.
Since we're kind of running up against time, Jennifer, I was wondering if, because the book came up a few times and it's not every day that we're having someone on whose book is actually so relevant to the kind of topic of the,
Right.
Did you want to give a quick elevator pitch for it? And
Sure. Yeah. So my book is Moving Up Without Losing Your Way, The Ethical Cost of Upward Mobility. And it's basically about what I saw when I was teaching at CUNY, which is that one of the aspects of upward mobility for first generation and low income students can be that they end up sacrificing in these relationships and their connections to their communities and their connections to their families. And that can actually be quite difficult and painful, and it complicates a student's achievement. Even as they feel like they're achieving success, they also feel very guilty and oftentimes sad and grieve like what they've lost in order to achieve what they have achieved. And so my book is about thinking about that as really a question of ethics, because students are often torn between wanting to do the right thing by their, for their parents or their friends or their communities, and then wanting to do the right thing for their own achievement, right? And so, and that those decisions don't go away. Like students make it when they decide where to go to college, what career path to pursue. If you're in academia, you're moving a lot. Usually you end up moving some, at least at the beginning of your career. And if you're if you really want a job, you have to be willing to go anywhere, or that's what they say anyway, right? And so that can take you really far from family. That can be really difficult sacrifice for all of us to make. But in particular, I think students who might feel not totally at home in the world of academia or in the world of the university, and then don't have like a community to go back to, and can feel very disconnected from both like the community they left and the community they're trying to join. That's the elevator pitch.
this is super interesting. Everybody check it out. Thank you. Oh yes, we have in the chat. I'm definitely going to go buy it.
Great.
Thank you again so much for doing this.
Yeah,
and sharing the story. That's super interesting.
Yeah, no, I'm glad. And thank you all for putting it together.